Yo, what's up? I'm the chess guy and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to look at chess strategy and more specifically about weak pawns. This is part of a bigger concept which is pawn structures, and there's a lot of things to say and talk about pawn structures, but for now we're going to focus on weak squares. So I'll explain to you what they are, and then we'll do some exercise together on how to create them, and we'll add some puzzles which you can start creating those weak pawns yourself. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for tuning in, and let's get started. So what is a weak pawn? There's different type of weak pawns, so let's just quickly examine them and what they are. These are isolated pawns, and that basically means a single pawn that is not able to be defended by another pawn, which is what you're currently seeing on the board. Another one is doubled pawns, so these are pawns in front of each other. There can also be triple pawns, which is when they're all three of them together. Very rare, but this can happen. And then there's also something called a backward pawn. So here you can see that the e3 pawn remains backwards and can be exploited by using the e file. So these are a couple of types of pawns. So let's have a look at how you can use a weak pawns to gain an advantage. When we look at this position, it's quite obvious that both the f and d6 pawn for black are kind of weak, and white's d3 pawn is also weak, since this would be a backward pawn, just like the d6 pawn, and the f6 pawn is doubled with the f7 pawns. But in the current position, there's not enough material to exploit the advantage. So one of the important things about a weak pawn is that you're able to attack it. And in the current situation, we don't really have any attackers, just the kings. So black can hold to a draw here with correct play. But if we add some pieces, for example, a bishop and knight, all of a sudden the position becomes winning, because white is going to be able to target f6 or the d6 pawn, while the black bishop is just only able to defend and not able to create any counter threats. So yeah, it's very important that you remember that creating a weak pawn is one part of getting the advantage. You also need the attackers to be able to attack the weak pawn. So the current position on the board, I'm very curious as to what you would think who is better here or who might be winning. Because when we look at the one aspect of weak pawns, it seems that white has nothing but weak pawns. All the pawns are isolated, the b pawns are doubled as well as the g pawn. So all of these pawns are technically weak. When you compare that to black's pawns, then you can say that maybe a6 and g6 are backwards pawn and d5 is a isolated pawn. But the b5 and f5 pawn look pretty good. But you have to take into account the possibilities of the attacker. So if you look at that, it seems that the black bishop is not able to attack anything. Actually, it's just trapped by its own pawns. And the knight, on the other hand, is able to move around and start attacking maybe a6 or g6. So who's better? It's actually white, because they're the one who are able to create threats and start attacking those backwards pawns on g6 and a6. And although it might seem at first glance that the white pawns are extremely weak, they are not vulnerable. So that is what I want you to remember about weak pawns, is that creating them is usually not so hard, but understanding when they are truly weak compared to when they appear weak, that is something that I'm hoping to convey in this video, and that is also what makes chess strategy so beautiful, because it's much more deeper than how it might appear at a first glance. So you're probably curious as to how you would win this, and I'm going to quickly show you how to do this. The general idea is to improve your knight by hitting this pawn while not allowing the black king to enter on d5. On e5. So the first move would be knight f3. Black can't do much but wait, so let's assume they shuffle the bishop. We bring our king in, the bishop goes back to wherever, and unfortunately for black, they can't really do much. And eventually, we'll get the position where we're going to bring in our knight to c5, and the bishop drops back to defend it. So currently, we would like to have black to move here. How would we create a situation where it's black to move? We waste a tempo by just playing a pawn move. So for example, g3. And now black has a very awkward choice to make, because if the king goes to c6, we'll have a look, then we just walk in with our king, and we can start grabbing these pawns and promote the g pawn. If, for example, they want to not allow that, it means that they will drop d5. So if king goes back, then we can just take here. And ultimately, the white king will walk in and just start grabbing all the pawns. So yeah, that's basically how you would win this type of endgame. And something I want to quickly mention is that if king c6, king e5, you might wonder, well, why not a5? Because the pawn can't take, you lose the knight. You can actually ignore that and you just simply allow this pawn to be taken. So king f6, if takes, and now the very nice but annoying move, knight d3, making sure the king cannot enter. And although black sort of won a pawn, it is meaningless because it doesn't make a difference. White will take g6, king f7, and promote the pawn. And there's not much that black can do. So let's do some exercises together, and at the end I'll add some exercises for you to start solving yourself. So in the current position is black to move, and yeah, find a way to cripple the pawns basically. So the hint would be it's that you can make these pawns isolated by trading the b pawn for the c pawn. So if black plays c5 here, it forces white to take, because if they don't, we will just win a pawn by taking twice on b4. So takes, takes, and now you see that the white c and a pawn became isolated, while the b and e pawn are still nicely protected by each other, or more specifically the b pawn protects this a6 pawn. But the point is that white now has two isolated pawns, which are more easily attacked, and potentially you will win this endgame. So in this position, we can create basically a next level fork, because if we play knight to d5, we're hitting the king and the king has to move. And once we take the bishop, look at the pawns. The pawns became doubled and isolated, and on top of that, the h6 pawn is also weak. So now you have great chances to winning one of these pawns and then carrying this game home to a quick dub. Here we have another one where we can see that the bishop is eyeing the knight, but the pawn is in the way. So what if we simply push the pawn, hit the bishop, bishop has to move, and after a takes, takes, we now see isolated doubled pawns for black, and this is a very good position. So in this position, black just took something on f3 and it's white to move. And if you're a bit careless, you would just recapture on f3 with the queen or knight. But in fact, what you should do is you should take on c6 first, because that's a check. The king has to respond, so he retakes. Now the next question is, how do you take back on f3? And this requires some newly insight into the position, because what has just changed is that the doubled pawns here on the c file are now doubled up, and you can also claim that c6 is a backwards pawn. So we also talked about strong squares in the previous video, but right now you want to envision yourself how you can exploit this. So you want to try and control this square. The knight is actually on the perfect route towards looking at c5. So this is why queen takes f3. It's much more logical. If you compare that to knight takes f3, the knight on f3 doesn't really have any squares that it can go to from f3, and it would have much rather be eyeballing c5. After something like queen f3, let's say knight e7, both sides castle, castle, white plays rook c1, and next move would be knight b3, and then knight c5, and you can maybe win this pawn and win the endgame. So with these exercises, I'm going to set you off to solving the 4 puzzles currently on the screen yourself. You can find the FIDE files and the answers down there as well. So good luck with those. Let me know if you're struggling or what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear from you in general about what you thought of the video, and if you're able to solve the puzzles that you're being shown right now. And thank you so much for watching it through the end. If you haven't, please consider subscribing, because I am going to plan much more videos about chess strategy in the near future. And also, I do stream on Twitch a lot, so if you want to tune in there for live action and ask some things that you might want to talk about, feel free to drop a follow and drop in the stream. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.